he's going to win the election by saying we're not doing Brexit, we're not going through the single currency. And I bet you he'll do all those things.
And then he's going to creep us back in.
Yeah,
and people will be suspicious of it. Yes.
And
yeah.
I think there are various. It is sort of dishonest in a way.
Yeah.
Because we'll get a lot of statements from Starmer under pressure from interviewers, saying, I'm definitely not going into single currency. I'm not doing this, and it'll make it politically much more difficult. I think it's probably dishonest.
Well, I'm delighted to be sitting down with Peter Oborne. He's an associate editor at Middle East Eye. He is the author of The Assault on Truth, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and The Emergence of a New Moral Barbarism, and The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam, among many other books and works. And I'm very keen to hear what he envisages for 2024. Peter, welcome.
Great pleasure to be here.
I wanted to start by turning to the current war in Gaza, which, as we speak, is, of course, ongoing, and I'd imagine it will be for some time. When the war began, you noted the arrival of David Cameron as Foreign Secretary and suggested this could herald a sort of return to what we used to call Arabism in the Foreign Office and British foreign policy. Do you feel that has happened?
Yeah. Well, it's a little while after the war had begun, actually. David Cameron cleverly moved. Cleverly, who wasn't up to the job of being Foreign Secretary, it has to be said. And until Cleverly went, and Sunak seems to me to be completely clueless when it comes to foreign policy, or actually not really interested, and not taken seriously by foreign leaders, with the possible exceptions of Maloney in Italy, with whom he has formed a populist
Very
alliance.
cosy, yeah.
And perhaps Narendra Modi in India, but generally speaking, he's a sort of damp squib, certainly as in foreign affairs, and cleverly hadn't had the courage or the political heft to try and do something about the terrible initial response by the British Prime Minister to when he went to Netanyahu and gave unequivocal support. It was already apparent from the statements by Netanyahu what he had in mind. And David Cameron was appointed after a few weeks, and the policy turned on its head in a sixpence. It was incredibly confident and striking that you immediately got a completely new language about the atrocities committed by the Israelis.
A new language in which we call for restraint.
It called for restraint. It called for the condemned maybe didn't quite as the killing of civilians, and also did a very important thing when Boris Johnson had been Prime Minister, I think it was as Prime Minister, he wrote a letter to a lobby group called the Conservative Friends of Israel, saying that Britain would not countenance war crimes investigations into Israeli conduct. And David immediately turned that on its head. So he changed that policy. And I've never seen, and what he, in the jargon of the sort of foreign policy experts, he sees the file.
I mean, British policy towards Israel and Gaza at the moment is I think globally regarded as being quite close to Israel. Are you saying that's mistaken?
No, I don't. I think that's right. And if you only looked at Andrew Mitchell's performance in the House of Commons, that it's still very pro-Israel. And certainly David Cameron hasn't got Britain behind a ceasefire. And do
you think he wants to?
I think he probably does, but I haven't spoken to him. But what he's certainly done is changed the sort of slavish support for the most outrageous prime minister Israel has probably ever had, and the most far right government Israel has ever had. The slavish support offered by Sunak, and I think I would very much like John Bew, the National Security Advisor. I also must bear a heavy responsibility for not just for this, but the wretched response. And I would like to see Cameron take over that job as well.
Why, in your view, is the default position of Britain generally towards Israel one of support rather than one that is more confrontational when Israel is doing things that some people would like to be confronted?
It's a really interesting question. And you see, if you go back 30 years to when Maggie Thatcher was Prime Minister. I mean, she was very pro-Israel, incredibly, not incredibly, admirably Semitic, you know. I mean, and yet she never had any difficulty in condemning war crimes by the Israeli army or the Israeli state. Classically, of course, in 1982, when Israel invaded the Lebanon, you got the atrocities in West Beirut. And Thatcher was, you know, called it pure barbarism.
But those weren't explicitly Israeli atrocities. They were militias, weren't
that
they?
was Sabra Shatila.
Yeah.
Yes, Israeli soldiers enabled a phalangist massacre of refugees in South, I think South Beirut, and Reagan as well. Again, very pro-Israel. He rang up Biden and sent him a message: stop the attacks in West Beirut. And by that afternoon, so Reagan rang up. Sorry, not Begin. So I'll start that again. Reagan rang up Begin, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel, and within half an hour he brought an end to the atrocities being committed by Israelis in West Beirut. Now, that kind of willingness by Britain and America to confront Israel when it goes much too far, I mean, absolutely, when it commits atrocities, it seems to have gone. And you're asking me what happened. Talking about Britain, I think there was, if you go back to the 40 years, Maggie Thatcher did have a sense of right and wrong. She'd put that ahead of geopolitical considerations. Britain, I think she was more independent of America, because really we allow ourselves to be told what to think and do by the United States. But Maggie, you remember that when there was a Caribbean island which was invaded in Grenada, I think, in 1983-4 by the Americans, and she absolutely spat blood. Mm-hmm. She had a sense of British national pride and identity, that we were a coherent country with a set of British values.
But with Gaza at the moment, the Israeli approach, while many would regard it as being excessive,
Say that again.
It's hard to see what's a preferable approach. I mean, what if you were advising the Israeli government, as I'm sure they will one day ask you to do?
I'm sure they won't. But,
what would you be asking them to? I mean, because look, Israel faced a horrific atrocity on October the 7th.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something really, really dreadful happened. It shook Israeli society to its core. It shook the sense of Israeli security that is so important to the Israeli population for both regional reasons and obvious historical reasons. Obviously, some response was required. What is the response they should have done that they have not done?
Well, going back, what Sunak should have, when he went to Tel Aviv, the British advice should have been, absolutely, Israel has a right to defend itself. Absolutely, these were atrocities, but don't go too far. Obey the rules of international human rights law, which, in my view and the view of most lawyers, have been absolutely smashed. Now, if you look, it's more than I was in the West Bank for quite a long time after the not in Gaza, but I was in the West Bank and Jerusalem for a long time after October the 7th, and now the Israelis have killed well over 20,000, probably nearer 30. It's 22
in Gaza.
Official, in Gaza. Nearly 10,000, probably actually already 10,000 children. And I don't know how much you follow what is actually happening on the streets, and it's not easy for British media or Western media to do this. But, for instance, Middle East Eye had obtained footage of a recent episode in Gaza where a woman was crossing a street with her child, and the child has a white flag, and he's just shot. No danger, just shot dead. And this is happening all the time, and these are atrocities. Terrible obscenities, actually. Yeah. Now, I completely accept that Hamas committed disgusting atrocities. It's a bit like Breivik in Norway, I mean, it's... but to respond to the power of 10 or 15, and the first thing to say, if I was Mr. Netanyahu's advisor,
When he calls, yes.
is that Israel has an international reputation, and it has been able to claim that it is a country, a democratic country, the representative of the values of the civilized world. I think he made that explicit claim, fighting barbarism. And you can't, in the wake of the last 3 months, you cannot make that claim. And that greatly reduces, Israel's been able to rely on the support of a lot of countries in the world, by no means all of them, and that's fading. I went to a Doha forum just before Christmas, and the isolation where America is now, the effects on America, what the hits being taken by America on behalf of Israel. I mean, the sense of disgust really at Biden from so many people one spoke to. The world is changing because of this. If we, the West, are going to countenance our closest ally committing war crimes on this kind of scale and letting them get away with it because it's ongoing, and the hypocrisy, it may not be too clear here in Britain because, in my view, the media coverage has been extraordinarily partial. But around the rest of the world...
But would you distinguish what Israel is doing in Gaza from actions that have been taken by other countries? Things that happened in Syria, things that happened in China, things that happened in Turkey. Do we focus on Israel because it is our ally? Because it is a nation to which we feel we ought to feel close.
I've seen this argument in Syria. The Assad regime committed disgusting acts. It's been sanctioned. It's been turned into a pariah state.
Well, it already was one, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, so the idea that the world hasn't reacted. Russia, Ukraine, committed an act of aggression in Ukraine. Immediate reactions from the West. Tremendous.
But the invasion of Gaza was. I mean, would you describe it as an act of aggression? I mean, from the start.
No, I said sorry. I'm comparing what. Sorry, let me clear what I was talking about.
Yeah.
So what you've had in Ukraine is the slaughter of civilians, the destruction of civilian buildings, infrastructure, the movement of peoples. All of this has been going on in Gaza.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, we absolutely correctly condemn what the Russians have been doing in Ukraine, and we appear to support Israel doing. This is how the rest of the world see it. Certainly, this is how the Palestinians see it. And I am afraid to say this is how I see it. On the one hand, we condemn what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, and we support what the Israelis are doing in Gaza.
And you feel we ought to draw a very clear parallel between those two things, and
it's just a parallel. It's just a double standard.
Right. Let's turn to the impact domestically. You've been very critical in the past of the role that Israel plays in our domestic politics. You made a film about the Conservative Friends of Israel. Tell us a bit about what you understand as being the role of groups like that and the impact of groups like that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I was critical. I made a film. It's almost unique. I think I'm the only political writer ever to have looked at in a serious way the Conservative Friends of Israel. I haven't really looked at the same organisation in the Labour Party, the Labour Friends of Israel, but but the Conservative Friends of Israel, and wasn't actually being critical. I just felt it was a proper piece of political analysis to show the power of the Israeli lobby. And I actually I did an investigation with Channel 4. We discovered that, for instance, after Gaza, was it 2000 and... Well, no, it was Lebanon, 2006, I think. William Hague announced in the floor of the House of Commons that what the Israelis were doing was disproportionate. This was at which point a sort of group from the Conservative Friends of Israel went to see David Cameron, the leader of the opposition, and extracted from him, I learnt, I promised not to use that language again. That's an example.
But why? Why? I mean, you talk about the power of this group. What is the power of this group? What hold does this group have over the people who are in it that motivates them to do that if they don't believe in that in the first place? If you understand, I mean, why is this group a powerful group rather than simply a collection of people who think a thing already?
Well, the Conservative Friends of Israel, and you said I criticised. I'm not sure I did. I described.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
They're very assiduous in cultivating future MPs, standing MPs. It has the membership of, I don't know, approximately, when I last looked, I don't know, they still keep records, 80% or so Tory MPs belong to. They have enormous clout over.
Again, what do you mean by clout?
All right, I'll give you another
what's
example.
The power they've
I'll give you
got?
another.
Yeah.
I'll give you a much more recent example. Incredibly bad idea, sponsored by the Conservative Friends of Israel, which convinced the British Prime Minister. This was to move the British, copy Trump, and move the British embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And they got both Sunak and Truss, who won that contest, to support it. Now, this was a mad idea. It would have caused absolute chaos. It alienated Britain from even sort of sympathetic Arab countries like Saudi. I mean, I go on and on. Yeah. And it's CFI. I got the document they were using to support this. They assembled the support. I think it was. You can't prove it, but it was a promise made during a leadership election by the two leading candidates. That's an example, and I think it would have happened if Trump, probably, if the hapless Truss had hung around, and then and of course there was opposition to it, but. That is an example of how they put a new plan on the table. Another one is Boris Johnson writing to the Conservative. What's it got to do with the British lobby group? Writing a letter to the Conservative Friends of Israel saying about we won't be supporting ICC prosecutions or investigations into war crimes. So they get that kind of.
Does it make them considerably different from the various other Conservative Friends group? Conservative Friends.
I think it's
Turkey,
they're in a different
Bangladesh,
class. They're in a different.
Simply because they're better at it, or because there's something fundamentally different there?
I honestly couldn't. I think that. Well, I would say this. I don't know. I'm just describing what I can see. I can't say why. I think probably when I looked at it 15 years ago, there was definitely a financial aspect. Money coming in
and going where?
To the Conservative Party itself.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
And they made a major role in sort of Conservative campaigning. Now, and people were afraid of them. I mean, I couldn't get a Tory MP to speak on them, and they would mock me. Nobody will ever publish this, they'd say to me, One of them actually sort of took his phone out.
Again, I'm struggling here. What do you think they were afraid of?
I don't know. In my view, nothing, right? But
do you think they were afraid?
Because I did all this stuff.
Do you think they were afraid of being called anti-Semitic?
I'm sure that may be one of it. But by the way, I was very careful when I did this work to remain on very good terms with them. I mean, Stuart Pollock, who is now he's Lord Pollock now. He was the director. He's now the chairman or something. I mean, I was always utterly straightforward with these, and I think that's what political journalists ought to do, is to say how power works within Westminster. There's no question of the CFI.
Sure. Let's turn to other domestic matters. While I've got you, I want to come back.
Can I make one last point about them? I mean, I think they've done an enormous disservice to Israel. I'll tell you why. They have never criticised Israel for anything, the CFI. I mean, I don't know if it existed in the time of Sabra Shatila, but they never anything. Now, I think that it would have been better if their strategy was not to support blindly, including the Likud government, the most far-right government. Stuart Pollock stood up in the House of Commons and came very close to criticising the British government for refusing to talk to Ben Gvir, who's a fascist, racist fascist. I mean, unbelievable. And so they will not, and I've asked them to provide me evidence of them doing this. They will not criticise Israel at all. And I think that's very bad news for Israel. I think it's much better if Britain could be a candid friend
Yep.
than rather a sort of just whatever Israel does. And I think part of the reason why we've had the Gaza tragedy and the gross overreaction and the war crimes in Gaza by the Israelis is because countries like Britain, instead of being a candid friend, as we were when Thatcher was Prime Minister, have become sort of almost slavish.
Yeah, I understand that. Let's talk about something very different. I want to talk, looking ahead to the domestic politics of now. I wanted to start by asking you about Brexit and your current views on Brexit. You were a very strong Eurosceptic once upon a time. You once wrote that the pro-Europeans find themselves in the same situation as appeasers in 1940,
Crikey,
or
you know
communists
like
after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Sorry to dredge that up, but you wrote a book. You wrote a book about the guilty men who had been behind the push for the single currency.
That was a single currency.
The single currency, yeah, sure. And a lot of the politics you appeared to, and do correct me, but appeared to espouse before the referendum seemed to have similarities with a lot of the anti-establishment stuff that was harnessed by the pro-Brexit lobby. In my understanding, you were pro-Brexit, you are now anti-Brexit.
Yeah.
If you could tell us a bit about your journey and how you came to that.
I wrote a piece in 2019 when Britain was still in the European Union, saying I thought I was wrong.
Right.
I supported Mrs May's deal.
In 2009, so post-Brexit, but before
post-Brexit, before Britain left.
Post-referendum, before the deal. Sure.
Sorry, I apologise.
Yeah.
Post-referendum.
Yeah.
And then I supported Mrs May's deal. I was then had a political columnist of the Mail.
Yep.
I actually went almost to the point of absurdity in supporting Mrs May's deal. I felt that was sensible enough. But when it was destroyed by Johnson, Linton Crosby and co, I felt that really what we were staring by then at a hard Brexit. And so I wrote a piece in, I think it was Open Democracy, somewhere like that, saying I'd changed my mind.
When you say you change your mind, does that mean you think you were wrong beforehand, or because circumstances developed in such a way that you feel you couldn't have foreseen and the situation was different?
I think it's a bit of both.
Right.
If you read the piece, it's available. I think that I was... I can't forgive myself for the error of judgment which led me to vote for Brexit, because I think what it led to was this period of chaos, and I think it was foreseeable, so I do regret my vote for Brexit.
Is there anything you regret about your writing long before that may have sowed the seeds of the Euroscepticism that led to Brexit? Because you were regarded as a very strong Eurosceptic voice in the media.
I don't think that's quite right. Actually, I don't think I was. I wasn't. I wasn't a great sort of.
You were by me.
Yeah, I think I wasn't in the sort of. I don't think you're quite right there. Nevertheless, I wrote on for instance, I think I had arguments which I think are still respectable. I still think the euro is a nightmare. And I was very persuaded by the democratic case for Brexit that the problem about the European Union is that it superimposes sort of a supranational apparatus, and there's a contradiction. You really have to have one state in the end. I still see that analysis, but I think that watching Brexit and how it produced the chaos that it did, I have to say that I was wrong.
Again, though, when you were writing in favour of Brexit, you said a lot of the things that you made a lot of the anti-establishment case in your writing. I wonder
whether I did. I was looking at the best piece I wrote. I think was in the.
I could quote you a little if it
would
be helpful.
Please, yeah.
No, well, sure. You talked about you described the outrageously heavy and persistent pressure that had been brought to bear on broadcast media, culminating in a cave-in to the government's bully boys when the media was basically sharing what came to be known as Project Fear. You very much bought into and spread the narrative that was Project Fear.
Probably. Yeah. By then, I think there were lies told on both sides. By the way,
sure,
and there were. But look, I'm perfectly happy to say I got it wrong on Brexit.
How important do you think Brexit is now as a political issue, and how important should it be?
One of the problems about British political discourse is that it's become deeply dishonest in various different ways. But one of the ways is that very often people don't want to talk. Leading politicians avoid the most important issues.
Yes, absolutely.
And the most important issue facing this country at the moment, and certainly in terms of, I think probably the most, is the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, nobody wants to talk about it. They
Yes.
want to pretend it doesn't exist.
On both sides, on all sides. Yeah.
I mean, and I think all the evidence points to the fact that Britain would be better off inside and it would be better for us. But I say all of the evidence, much of the evidence. But nobody will address it. I wish that Keir Starmer, but there we are, had not taken this sort of almost comatosely cautious approach to these sorts of issues and run a proper campaign for Britain to come back into the European Union.
Really?
Yeah, and I think it would have, because what he's going to do, he's going to win the election by saying we're not doing Brexit, we're not going through the single currency, and I bet you he'll do all those things.
And then he's going to creep us back in.
Yeah,
and people will be suspicious of it. Yes.
And
Yeah.
I think there it is sort of dishonest in a way.
Yeah.
Because we'll get a lot of statements from Starmer under pressure from interviewers, saying, I'm definitely not going into single currency. I'm not doing this, and it'll make it politically much more difficult. I think it's probably dishonest, and it means that people won't have voted for what they will get. I mean, it's not the only case in point when it comes to Keir Starmer. He's a very, very cautious person, and I think that's a sadness.
Well, I'm interested to know what you think of Starmer and Starmer's Labour Party generally. I remember you once described Jeremy Corbyn as a breath of fresh air.
I still think that. Yeah.
Is Keir Starmer also a breath of fresh air?
No, he's not a breath of fresh air. But let's start with the government at the moment.
Yeah,
we have
sure.
One of the worst governments we've ever had, possibly the worst for the last 5 years. I don't think it's corrupt.
Tell me why. I'm not taking issue with anything you're saying, but tell me why.
The first thing is, for me, is the attack on due process, the rule of law.
Which goes back to Boris Johnson.
Yeah,
beyond,
it goes back
yeah.
before. But that's, the habitual lying, which you've never had before, by the way, in British politics, not even from Tony Blair, who was bad. And I find that the kind of cronyism, cronyism is a code word for corruption, but we haven't had proven corruption cases. And so until we do, we'll just use the word cronyism and we won't mention any names. But the COVID stuff.
Yeah.
And the attack on British, as a conservative, which I still am sort of morally and intellectually, I wouldn't dream of voting for them, but is about institutions, the rule of law, the monarchy, Parliament, and you've had this government has lied to the Queen. I found that absolutely beyond belief. It attacks the rule of law. It finds endless ways of trying to bypass Parliament. It's a terrible government. Now,
can I just to jump in there? What you're talking about is the manner in which the government behaves, and I wouldn't take issue with any of that in terms of due process and so on. What do you think about what appears to be the ideology of the government? Do you agree with the government on, policy? Do you agree with the government on, for example, and what do you think of, for example, the Rwanda policy?
Policy is, I think they've given up the idea of governing.
Right.
I mean, let's look at Rwanda. I don't think there's any. They knew that Rwanda wouldn't work. I think you can manage immigration sensibly with France. You can set up legal processes.
Do you think we should have considerably lower immigration, or are you less? I mean, because I think you want You once did, I think. I'm trying to if
No,
your
no.
views
What
on
I
that have
did,
changed.
and I might have done. Sorry, I can't remember writing that.
Oh,
What
don't worry. I don't
definitely,
remember all my columns
yeah,
either.
no,
It's
no.
fine. Yeah.
But what I think
Yeah.
what I definitely did do, but I want to
Yeah.
is about 20 years ago when I was at the Spectator, I looked at the nature of political debate, and it was a very it happened under Blair too. I very much disliked that they had a real policy of, or rather, they had a real policy of encouraging mass immigration.
Yeah.
And they had a stated policy of attacking immigrants.
Absolutely.
And that is what I went for. And I analysed it in a book, actually. And Blunkett would use horrible language about immigrants while actually they were encouraging
And there were great similarities now.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it would have been much better if Tony Blair had who started a lot of this dishonest politics, I think. He said, look, we need immigrants. They're good. They're very, very good people, and the economy won't work without them. And I think that, and actually, the whole of Britain is founded on immigration, and they've given lots of wonderful examples. And he never had the courage. He thought it would lose him an election, I think. I mean, obviously, and so that is, I believe,
Yeah. No, that's
what
fair.
I wrote.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I exposed it with quite some detail, how that went. But going back to Rwanda, it's classic. This government is not interested in government at all. It's driven by a series of really low-grade people. I can in which context there's somebody called Isaac Lebido inside Downing Street, just gone inside this week, I think, who used to work for Linton Crosby, and it is about. It shames me, and we shouldn't have people like this anywhere near Downing Street. They're interested in creating what they call wedge issues, which is issues which anger and inflame people.
Yes.
And falsely divide them. And they're typically issues of very little consequence. Now, Rwanda and the associated thing behind it, which is Britain moving out of the international rule of law, European Court of Human Rights and so forth. That is, Rwanda, I don't think was ever, they must have been advised that that wasn't ever going to happen. And it falls therefore into it started under Johnson, was given to the Sun, I seem to remember, classic piece of manipulative populism. And then you got it falls in like that. Do you remember the bridge between sort of Scotland and Ireland?
Yes, wonderful.
Johnson kept on coming up with ideas which would make headlines around the place.
Like his airport, all of them, yeah.
And Rwanda was like that. And the tragedy of Sunak, because when Sunak took over, there was a feeling that he was actually Mr. Sensible. And of course and we're now reading that he was nervous about, didn't like the Rwanda idea. And if he'd come in and say, look, the Rwanda's nonsense, we're not going to do it, he would have given himself such moral authority, instead of which he carried on with this.
But do you think it's going to, I don't mean the policy, I mean the politics, do you think it's going to work when we come to the election this year, we assume this year, do you think we're going to have a real election where the parties have different stances on real issues, or are we going to be in this thicket of issues like Rwanda, of war on woke, all that kind of stuff?
Can I tell you, I'm terrified of how the Tories are going to behave this year. Rather reinforced, actually, by a piece by Katie Balls in this week's Times about the sort of use of TikTok and so on, as where politics has gone. I mean, but mainly because of this very underreported event just before Christmas, when the British Prime Minister whizzes off to Italy and doesn't have a head of state, a Prime Minister on Prime Minister meeting with Maloney. He joins her sort of political rally.
Yeah.
And now Maloney is that is very significant, because Maloney, along with Oborne and others and sort of what do they call it now, the Front National, the National Rally in France, that is a territory which is being identified by more and more European politicians and American politicians as really fertile territory, which is adopting the French concept of the Great Replacement theory. And I read with some care Sunak's speech at Meloni's rally. Why he had to go and make it in Italy, I don't know. And he's basically saying, my interpretation of it, that Britain is going to fight the next election on the Great Replacement theory.
Which he can't believe. I mean,
Of course he doesn't believe it.
For people who don't know, the Great Replacement theory is this idea that immigration is a plot to replace the white Western population of Europe with more easily biddable immigrants, right? Basically,
Yeah,
roughly, often conceived of as being
theory,
masterminded by the Jews. Yeah,
and there can be, not always, a Jewish an anti-Semitic element to this.
So you think he's nodding to this stuff because he believes it has traction?
Well, I think he takes advice. Now, Linton Crosby is one of the most under-examined figures in recent British political history. He's the most significant political strategist of our time. I don't think he's going to be part of this election, by the way. I think he's pulled out. But he won an election from Morrison in Australia 4 times in a row against many odds. And it was by doing this stuff about inspiring hatred. And Levideau is his protege in number 10 now. And if that is where the Tories are going, and it does look like it, and it's supported by the fact that he tolerated this nightmare creature with far-right leanings, Braverman, cleverly has lacked the personal courage to bang it all on the head. He obviously doesn't like it. He called it, didn't he? He said it was a load of nonsense. But he's taken it on board. So they're fighting. They don't believe it. Yeah. But they're fighting this very strong populist campaign.
Well, and how do you think Labour will respond to that?
Yeah, that is a really important question. See, what you and I think possibly on the same wavelength here. I would love Starmer to make a speech defending immigration, saying we're not going to go down the murky and disgusting road of these Tory neo-fascists almost. I mean, we can start to get to that territory. We're not there yet, but we are moving there. And we're going to have sensible methods of dealing with immigration. Yes, we welcome immigrants. Yes, but on the other hand, it's got to be properly fair, legal, and well managed. And then he can take the high moral ground and fight the election on that. I wonder. He's got the choice. I don't think we know which way he's going on it.
Do you think it'd be a vote winner if he did that, or do you think it would be a disaster? I mean, electorally.
Yeah. Personally, I think it would be a vote winner. I think they're so discredited. But I agree, it's a difficult decision for Starmer to make, and he feels he's got to win the next election. I understand why he feels that. It's it would grossly. But I think the Tories are so discredited now. I mean, I took some heart, by the way, from Mr. Starmer's speech Keir Starmer, his speech this week. Yeah. I thought it was sensible. I thought I like the big nods to due process, and I like the fact that the sort of, the political editor of GB News said this is the old politics, stodgy stuff, whereas GB News sound like trash. Yeah.
Well, look, there's a huge amount more I'd like to ask you about. I'm conscious we're running low on time, so I wanted to finish off by asking you about your own political journey, and tell me, by all means, if I've misunderstood your political journey. But it seems to me you still describe yourself as a conservative. You were once very keen on, for example, Ian Duncan Smith. You were very hostile to Tony Blair and much that he did. Certainly you wrote in such a manner. You now find yourself in a position where, as you say, you're quite approving of many aspects of Keir Starmer. A lot of what you write is supported by people who would consider themselves, if not on the left, often on the left. You were supportive of many of the things Jeremy Corbyn said. If not on the left, then certainly the centre left. I'm interested to know whether you think you have changed or whether you've stayed still and everything else has changed.
It's probably a bit of both. I mean, it is a question of. Yes. Well, in 1978, Paul Johnson, he was a great political writer, wrote a piece. I remember sitting on a train reading it, and it was about. I apologise. I'll do this again slightly. I apologise. In 1978, Paul Johnson, who had been editor of the New Statesman, and he was really, and I absolutely revered as a political writer, modelled myself on him to some extent, sensationally recanted from. He wrote an article in which he said, "I'm going to vote Tory at the next election. I can't. The Labour's had it. Doesn't stand for Labour Party values." I remember reading this, and then I read the response by a poet called, I think, James Fenton, who was then the political editor of the New Statesman, and he started off with this brilliant metaphor. He said, "You know, when you're in a train leaving a station, and you think your train's moving, but actually it's the other train." And I definitely think that the Tory party, you can argue that I stayed exactly the same place. I believe in Burkean conservatism, but the Tory party now, it has, above all, attacked the institutions. It's torn them to shreds. It hates institutions. It's become part of a far-right conservative movement. That's the way I see it. And I think if you believe that old-fashioned Toryism, which starts really with Croker and in the 1830s, gets real head of steam and finds its intellectual stimulus in Burke, and is then sort of intellectually, you've got Oakeshott sort of stimulating and the great 20th centuries, Salisbury, Balfour, Macmillan, Baldwin, even Thatcher, all part, Major very much so. This lot are nothing to do with that. Right. They are part of a far-right conservative, far-right movement, nothing to do with British conservatism at all. They become clientelism. Let me use the terms of political science. It's about rewarding your people who back you. It's about making sure there isn't a fair playing field. It's about fixing all the institutions so they'll sell your stories. It's about abuse of power as a way of doing business, and that's awful. So I really hope that Starmer can find a way of articulating a response to that. Nick Cohen keeps on making this brilliant point that actually the Tories, by tearing a shreds due process, of course, Starmer they haven't got a leg to stand on if Starmer does the same thing and uses the institutions of state for his own purposes, for his party political purposes, which is to say, rather than that sort of benign national politics when we're all ultimately on the same side, even though we disagreed very honourably about important matters. That is the politics I believe in, and I think Starmer is much closer to it, I'm afraid, than Sunak, who's just hopelessly out of his depth.
As a Burkean conservative, then, what are your views on the monarchy, which is at a torrid time recently, most recently with new revelations in court about Prince Andrew's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and we've also had, of course, the various assaults on the British monarchy. Some would see them by Prince Harry. Are you a monarchist? Have you always been a monarchist? Will you remain a monarchist?
Very much a monarchist. I think it stands for something wonderful about British history, and it's very important that the head of state is not a politician and doesn't have to be run for office or anything like that. So the key thing, Orwell wrote a very important little essay about 1944 about however absurd the monarchy was. Hitler was able to merge the symbolism of state with the Nazis, and Mussolini likewise in Italy, similarly in Italy, and in Britain, fussy old George V, or George VI, I think it was. It wasn't available. Yeah. I don't think the Andrew thing. I'm rather critical of the coverage of Andrew, not because he isn't a sleazy person getting everything, but the importance of Epstein actually is rather Andrew's nothing to do with it. He's a very minor figure, I suspect. I mean,
what was the importance? No, what was the importance?
Well, we don't know yet. I mean, what we're seeing, though, it's looking more and more like a blackmail operation, isn't it? These sex tapes. Why did he take sex tapes?
If they exist.
Yeah, the alleged sex tapes. Yeah. And, it allegedly it involves some of the most powerful people in the and richest people on the planet. Two presidents now. I mean, and very major businessmen and so forth. It sort of feels. I don't really want to. I think for legal reasons, it's important not to talk about it very much. But it's now looking like quite an extraordinary a blackmail operation, and on behalf of whom, who knows? But what? In other words, Prince Andrew, silly arse, behaved very stupidly and badly. But
what's the point in blackmailing him?
Yes.
Peter Oborne, thank you very much indeed.